In the cold, jagged peaks of the Blood Moon Pack, tradition was not just a suggestion. It was a law carved in stone and written in the blood of the fallen. Only the strongest were permitted to carry the lineage forward, and Alpha Silas was a man obsessed with the idea of a perfect legacy. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, convinced that any flaw in the bloodline was a rot that would destroy the pack's dominance. He didn't just demand loyalty from his warriors, he demanded genetic perfection. To Silas, a wolf was only as valuable as the power it could project, and he had spent his entire reign pruning the weak from his ranks like dead branches from a winter oak. He believed that the strength of the Alpha was reflected in the purity of his heirs, and he had waited years for the moon to bless him with a successor who would dwarf his own legendary status. His halls were decorated with the skulls of enemies and the banners of conquered territories, but his heart remained an empty, echoing vault, waiting for the one thing he could not seize by force: a son worthy of his shadow. He had consolidated power across 7 valleys, crushed the rebellious southern clans, and built a fortress that was said to be impenetrable. Yet, as he stood upon his balcony overlooking the frozen expanse of his kingdom, he felt the gnawing hunger of a man who had everything but a future. Before we dive into today's heartbreaking journey, I want to see how far our pack reaches. Drop a comment right now and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? I love seeing our global community grow. Elara was Silas's fated mate, a woman of grace and quiet resilience who had survived the harsh winters of the north by his side. She was his balance, the soft velvet to his jagged steel. For years, she had been the only one who could look into his obsidian eyes without flinching. She saw the man behind the monster, the boy who had been raised in the frost and taught that love was a vulnerability. When she finally announced she was pregnant, the pack celebrated for 7 days and nights. The fires of the citadel burned so bright they could be seen from 3 territories away, a beacon of hope for a pack that lived and breathed for the next generation. Silas had been uncharacteristically gentle during those first few months. He would sit by the hearth, his large, scarred hand constantly resting on her belly, as if he could already feel the heartbeat of a conqueror. He spoke of the pup as if it were already an alpha, a warrior who would lead the Blood Moon to heights never before imagined. He spent hours with the pack architects, designing new wings for the nursery that looked more like a fortress than a room for a child. He commissioned silver-lined cradles and weapons forged from the finest star iron, all for a child that had not yet taken its first breath. But as the months passed and the pregnancy progressed, a strange and terrifying change began to take hold of Elara's body. It started as a faint shimmer beneath her skin, a pearlescent glow that she initially dismissed as a trick of the flickering candlelight in their stone chambers. She thought perhaps it was the Alpha's glow, a phenomenon rumored to happen when a high-ranking wolf carried a powerful heir. But within weeks, the shimmer turned into distinct, bioluminescent silver veins that pulsed with a rhythmic celestial light. They didn't look like any pregnancy the pack healers had ever seen in their 1,000-year history. These veins seemed to hum when the moon was high, vibrating with a frequency that made the very air around Elara feel electric. The child or children inside her were not acting like normal wolf pups. They didn't kick with the playful aggression of a future warrior. They resonated. Every time Elara closed her eyes, she felt a presence in her marrow that was ancient, vast, and utterly alien to the wolfkin. She felt as though she were carrying the weight of the stars themselves, a burden that was both beautiful and terrifying. The healers began to whisper. The elders began to cast suspicious glances. The word omen began to float through the halls of the citadel like a poisonous fog. Some said she was cursed by the spirits of the woods. Others whispered that the Alpha's line had finally become too thin, snapping under the weight of his own hubris. To Silas, this wasn't a blessing. It was a deformity. He stood over Elara in the damp stone of the royal chambers, the orange firelight reflecting in his eyes, which had turned as cold as flint. He watched the silver light beneath her skin with a growing sense of revulsion. He saw the light not as power, but as a mutation, a glitch in the bloodline that would make his heir a freak in the eyes of his enemies. He was a man who feared what he could not control. And he could not control the light that was radiating from his mate's womb. In his mind, his heir was supposed to be a golden wolf, a creature of teeth and claw, not a glowing anomaly that whispered of stars and spirits. The fear of being perceived as weak by the rival packs, the black claw and the silver fang, twisted his love into a violent protective rage for his own reputation. He imagined the whispers at the Council of Alphas, the snickers of other kings as they looked upon his glowing son. His pride was a mountain, and the silver light was a crack in its foundation that he could not tolerate. He began to distance himself from her, sleeping in the barracks with his soldiers, unable to look at the light that mocked his desire for a traditional warrior king. "It is a mutation, Elara, a curse that will poison our history," Silas spat, his voice echoing off the cold walls. He didn't listen when Elara claimed she felt a power unlike anything she had ever known, a power that felt protective and sacred. He didn't care that the child's heartbeat was steady and strong. He only saw a blemish on his perfect record, a mistake of nature that had to be erased. He felt betrayed by the moon goddess, and in his arrogance, he decided he would correct the mistake himself. He called his head of guards, Marek, a man who had served him since he took the throne, and gave the order that would shatter Elara's world forever. He convinced himself that he was doing it for the good of the pack, that a broken heir would lead to the downfall of everything he had built. "Get rid of the mutation," Silas commanded, his voice devoid of any fatherly warmth or husbandly mercy. "I will not have a freak as an heir. Cleanse the line, or I will do it myself. I would rather have no son than one that looks like a ghost." He turned his back on Elara, walking out of the room without a single backward glance, leaving the woman he had promised to protect to face a death sentence for the crime of carrying a child that didn't fit his narrow definition of strength. He had ordered the death of his own blood before it had even taken its first breath, all to satisfy a pride that had become his only god. He spent the night in the training pits, striking at dummies until his knuckles bled, trying to kill the image of the silver light that was etched into his mind. He ordered a feast for his men, a hollow celebration to drown out the silence of his conscience, while his mate sat in a locked room awaiting her fate. But Elara was no longer the submissive mate Silas expected. The motherly instinct within her had flared into a white-hot sun, eclipsing her fear of her mate. That night, as the moon reached its peak, she felt the silver light pulse with a new intensity, a protective shield forming around her heart. When the guards came for her, led by Marek, who looked at her with eyes full of hidden sorrow, she didn't plead for her life. She used a strength she didn't know she possessed, fueled by the very energy Silas despised. She moved with a speed that defied the weight of her pregnancy, slipping past the guards and escaping through the narrow servant tunnels. She fled into the Whispering Woods, a place so dangerous and thick with ancient, vengeful spirits that even the most seasoned alpha warriors feared to tread there. She ran until her lungs burned and her feet bled, guided by the silver pulse in her stomach, which seemed to light the path through the darkness like a living lantern. The forest, usually hostile to outsiders, seemed to part for her. The brambles curled back and the shadows retreated, acknowledging the royal blood she carried. She found a sanctuary in the deepest thicket, where the air was still and the spirits of the ancestors watched over her with curious, glowing eyes. What Silas did not know, and what the ancient, forbidden scrolls of the high priest warned of in hushed tones, was that the silver glow was the mark of the twin suns. It was a phenomenon that occurred only once every 1,000 years, signaling that the Alpha King had fathered children who were not merely wolves, but the sovereigns of the entire supernatural world. They were the ones destined to unite the packs, bring an end to the era of brutal, senseless war, and usher in 1,000 years of peace. They were not mutations. They were the correction, the moon goddess's final answer to a world that had forgotten the meaning of balance. They carried the power of the day and the night, the fire of the sun and the chill of the moon. Silas, in his blind quest for a warrior, had tried to extinguish the light that was meant to save his people from their own darkness. For months, Elara lived as a ghost in the heart of the forest, sheltered in a cabin protected by ancient glamours and tended to by a blind midwife named Hestia, who had been waiting decades for the prophecy to be fulfilled. Her belly grew, and the silver light became so intense that it illuminated the trees for miles, making the forest look as though it were permanently caught in the first rays of dawn. She learned that she wasn't carrying one child, but two, twins who represented the sun and the moon, bound together in her womb. Hestia spoke of the children as the new dawn, and she taught Elara how to communicate with them through the light. Elara felt them responding, their tiny spirits reaching out to hers with a wisdom that transcended their unborn state. They were not afraid of the father who had rejected them. They were simply waiting for the moment they would change the world. On the night of the birth, the sky didn't just turn dark. It turned a deep, bruised crimson, and the stars seemed to align in a pattern that hadn't been seen for an age. Back at the palace, Silas was suddenly gripped by an agonizing burn in his chest. It was the mating bond, the sole tether he thought he had successfully ignored, and it was screaming with a force that brought him to his knees in the middle of his great hall. He felt a presence in the air, two presences, that made his own alpha wolf howl in an instinctual, terrifying submission. He realized then that he had made a catastrophic mistake. He saw the silver light rising from the whispering woods, a pillar of energy so bright it made the stars look like dim embers. The bond flared with white-hot intensity, showing him glimpses of the light he had tried to kill, and for the first time in his life, Alpha Silas felt the cold touch of true terror. Driven by a feral, uncontrollable instinct, Silas raced into the forest, his massive black wolf tearing through the brush. He followed the light, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a desperate late-blooming hope. He smashed through the door of the cabin, his claws extended and his teeth bared, expecting to find a scene of horror or a monster to slay. Instead, he found Elara bathed in a celestial silver light, looking more like a goddess than a wolf mate. In her arms she held two infants whose eyes were already open, solid silver with no pupils, glowing with a terrifying sovereign power. They were perfectly formed, their tiny bodies radiating a heat that felt like a summer afternoon in the middle of the winter. The moment Silas stepped into the room, his knees hit the floor. He didn't choose to kneel. His muscles simply refused to support him in the presence of the infants. The very air around them was heavy with an authority that made his alpha status feel like a child's toy. They weren't monsters. They were the apex of creation. They were the heirs he had prayed for, but they were far too great for him to ever claim as his own. Silas fell into the dust, his head bowed as the realization of his sin finally crushed him. He had ordered the death of the greatest legacy the world had ever seen. He had called his own kings mutations. He reached out a trembling hand, but the light from the infants pushed him back, a silent refusal of his fatherhood. The twins didn't cry. They looked at him with a judgment that was older than the mountains. Elara looked down at him, her eyes cold and steady, reflecting the silver light of her sons. You ordered their death, Silas. You called them a rot. You forfeited your right to be their father the moment you turned your back on us in that chamber. You wanted a legacy of blood and iron, but the moon has given us a legacy of light. These are not your warriors. These are the world's saviors, and they do not recognize a butcher as their sire. Silas tried to speak, to beg for forgiveness, to claim them as his own now that he saw their power, but his tongue felt like lead in his mouth. He was no longer the king, he was a subject in the presence of his betters. He watched as Elara stood up, her strength fully restored, her beauty ethereal. "You have no kingdom anymore, Silas," Elara said, her voice sounding like a choir of 1,000 echoes. "The mutation you feared is the only thing that will save this world, and you will never be a part of it. You will live the rest of your days knowing that you threw away the suns for the sake of a shadow. Your fortress will crumble, and your banners will rot, but their light will endure forever." She walked out of the cabin, the snow melting into a path of spring flowers wherever she stepped, leaving the Alpha King broken and alone in the dirt of the forest he thought he owned. He had wanted a legacy, and he had gotten one, but he would only ever be the man who was too blind to see the sun when it was right in front of him. He stayed in that cabin for 3 days, weeping for a future he had destroyed with his own hands, while Elara and the twins disappeared into the white light of the new era. The Blood Moon Pack would soon learn that their king was hollow, and the throne he occupied was nothing more than a chair of cold stone. Silas realized his mistake far too late. He let his ego destroy the only thing that mattered, and now he is a king without a crown, and a father without a name. If you think Elara was right to leave him in the mud and protect her royal twins from his pride, show your support for the White Queen by hitting that like button right now. It really helps our pack grow and tells the algorithm that we value strength and loyalty over pride. And if you want to see the twins grow up to reclaim their father's kingdom and see what kind of powers they develop as the new sovereigns, make sure to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you never miss a chapter of this epic journey. What do you think the twins should be named? Let me know your best royal name suggestions in the comments below. See you in the next one.